Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where the past's most ridiculous moments are told exactly as they shouldn't be. Tonight, you're Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's spymaster, and you're about to remember the time you orchestrated the Emperor's most humiliating defeat, using rabbits, hundreds of them. Sweet dreams. You hadn't meant to do anything really, not at first, but there you were, standing in the shadows of the Tuileries Palace, watching Napoleon strut across the marble floors like a peacock who'd discovered mirrors. His boots clicked with that particular rhythm of a man who believed the world owed him applause for simply existing. Click, click, click. Each step a small declaration of war against humility. That week had been especially insufferable. He'd conquered Austria again. Or perhaps it was Prussia. You never bothered to keep track of his little geography lessons. And the celebration had stretched on for days. Days of toasts. Days of speeches. Days of watching grown men genuflect before a Corsican who stood barely taller than your writing desk. You sipped your wine and smiled. You always smiled when you were thinking. The idea came to you slowly, like honey dripping from a broken jar. Something about the way he'd dismissed Marshal Berthier's suggestion for a quiet countryside retreat. Hunting, Napoleon had scoffed, waving his hand as if swatting flies. What is the point of hunting rabbits when I could be conquering kingdoms? Ah, but you saw the point. You saw it perfectly. You began to plant seeds. Not in gardens, you'd never been one for dirt under your fingernails, but in conversations. A word here, a suggestion there. The Emperor looks tired, you'd murmur to Talleyrand over cards. Perhaps some fresh air, some simple pleasures? To Josephine, always so concerned with his moods, a hunt might refresh his spirits. Something peace. You never pushed, you never insisted, you simply waited, the way spiders wait, spinning thoughts into webs until your prey walked into them willingly. And Napoleon, predictable as sunrise, began to warm to the idea, not because he wanted it, oh no, that would have been too simple, but because he'd convinced himself it was his own brilliant notion. Berthier, he'd commanded one morning, startling the poor marshal from his breakfast. Arrange a hunt, something grand, something worthy of an emperor. You watched from across the room, your expression as neutral as milk. Inside, you were purring. Berthier, ever the faithful dog, began his preparations immediately. He consulted with groundskeepers, arranged for beaters, selected the finest hunting rifles from the imperial armory. Such diligence, such attention to detail, such complete and utter ignorance of what you had in mind, because you, dear Joseph Fouché, had your own preparations to make. You visited the rabbit sellers of Paris, not the grand markets where nobles shopped, oh no, that would have left a trail, but the small warrens where peasants traded in fur and meat. You spoke with farmers, suggested purchases, recommended suppliers, always with that same innocent smile, that same helpful tone. The Emperor's hunt, you'd explain. We want only the finest specimens. And they were fine specimens indeed. Plump from good feeding, docile from human contact, accustomed to being fed by hand, to associating the sight of people with the promise of fresh vegetables and grain, domestic rabbits, you might say. Pets, almost. Certainly not the wild, skittish creatures that would scatter at the first sight of a hunting party. You selected your accomplices carefully. Not co-conspirators, that word implies shared knowledge, and you preferred to work alone, but unwitting assistants. The groundskeeper who needed extra income for his daughter's dowry. The stable boy who could use a few coins for his mother's medicine. Good, honest people who asked no questions when you suggested they might supplement the hunt's usual arrangements. Perhaps, you mentioned casually, we could ensure the Emperor has plenty of targets. It would be such a shame if he returned empty-handed. They nodded. They understood. They wanted to please. How delightfully simple people became when they thought they were helping. As the days passed, you watched Napoleon's excitement grow. He spoke of strategy, of marksmanship, of the ancient art of the hunt. He practiced his aim in the palace gardens, startling servants with the crack of his pistol. He commissioned a new hunting outfit, complete with boots of the finest leather and a coat that caught the morning light just so. You encouraged him, naturally. What excellent form, Your Majesty. Such precision, The rabbits won't know what struck them. And they wouldn't, but perhaps not in the way he imagined. The night before the hunt, you stood at your window, looking out over Paris. The city slept fitfully, as cities do, full of dreams and schemes and small desperations. Somewhere out in the countryside, in carefully arranged cages, hundreds of rabbits dozed in their straw, bellies full of the finest hay money could buy. He poured himself a glass of brandy and raised it to the darkness. Tomorrow, you thought, would be educational, for everyone involved. You'd learned long ago that power was a peculiar thing. It flowed like water, seeking its own level, and those who understood its currents could redirect it with the gentlest touch. Napoleon believed power came from cannons and cavalry charges, from grand declarations and grander victories. But you knew better. Sometimes power was simpler than that. Sometimes power had ears and whiskers and an insatiable appetite for fresh vegetables. You finished your brandy and went to bed, sleeping the sleep of the righteous, or perhaps the sleep of the supremely vindictive. In the morning you'd discover there wasn't much difference between the two, because something was coming. Oh yes, something was definitely coming, and it was going to be absolutely delicious. The morning arrived with the politeness of a well-trained servant, quietly, efficiently, without calling attention to itself. You dressed carefully, choosing clothes that suggested mild interest rather than eager anticipation. A minister of police must maintain certain standards, after all, even when he's about to orchestrate a masterpiece. The hunting party assembled in the courtyard of Malmaison, like actors taking their positions for a play they didn't know they were performing. Napoleon stood at the centre, resplendent in his new hunting attire, his chest puffed with the particular pride of a man about to demonstrate his mastery over nature. Around him, his marshals and generals arranged themselves in order of importance, a human constellation orbiting its self-appointed sun. Marshal Berthier bustled about with his usual nervous energy, checking and rechecking arrangements that had already been checked to perfection. "The beaters are positioned, Your Majesty," he announced, consulting his pocket watch for perhaps the dozenth time. "The dogs are ready. The targets have been arranged as requested." Ah, those targets! You hid your smile behind a careful sip of morning wine. If only dear Berthier knew how thoroughly his arrangements had been arranged. The carriages awaited, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool air. The weapons had been inspected, cleaned, loaded with the ceremony due to instruments of imperial sport. Everything proceeded with the mechanical precision of a Swiss timepiece. You took your place among the lesser courtiers, maintaining the unassuming position that had served you so well over the years. Let others jostle for proximity to power, you preferred to observe from the shadows, where you could see everything and be seen by no one who mattered. The journey to the hunting grounds passed pleasantly enough. Napoleon held court from his carriage, regaling his captive audience with stories of previous hunts, previous conquests, previous demonstrations of his superiority over man and beast alike. His voice carried clearly through the morning air, each anecdote polished to a shine through countless repetitions. You listened with half an ear, your attention focused instead on the landscape rolling past. Somewhere ahead, in carefully prepared clearings, your other preparations waited. The groundskeeper's son would have arrived before dawn, as instructed. The cages would be positioned precisely where you'd indicated, not too close to the starting point, where suspicion might arise, but not so far that the main event would lack proper witnesses. The hunting grounds themselves were lovely in the way that nature becomes when shaped by human hands into something more presentable than mere wilderness. Rolling meadows dotted with copses of trees, gentle hills that wouldn't unduly tax the imperial legs, streams that babbled just loudly enough to provide pleasant background music without drowning out conversation. Marshal Berthier had chosen well. Or rather, he'd chosen exactly what you gently suggested he choose during one of those casual conversations that shape the world, while appearing to discuss nothing more significant than the weather. The party disembarked with the usual ceremony. Servants rushed to assist, weapons were distributed, positions were assigned. You accepted your rifle with appropriate dignity, though you had no intention of firing it. Today you were here to observe, not participate. Today you were critic, not performer. Napoleon took his position at the centre of the line of hunters, naturally. To his right stood Marshal Murat, whose reputation for bravery in battle was matched only by his fondness for elaborate uniforms. To his left, General Duroc, steady and reliable as granite. Behind them, a supporting cast of colonels and aides-de-camp, all eager to demonstrate their loyalty through superior marksmanship. "Gentlemen," Napoleon called, his voice carrying easily across the meadow, "today we hunt not as soldiers, but as sportsmen. Let us show these creatures what French precision can accomplish." A cheer went up from the assembled company. Rifles were raised in salute. Someone, you thought it might have been Marshal Lannes, began to sing La Marseillaise, until a sharp look from Napoleon cut the performance short. The beaters took their positions in the distance, their flags and noisemakers ready to drive the game toward the waiting guns. Everything was arranged, everything was perfect, everything was exactly as it should be, except for one small detail that only you knew about. The signal was given. The beaters began their work, moving through the distant brush with practiced efficiency. Shouts echoed across the meadow. Whistles pierced the air. Flags waved in careful patterns designed to funnel prey toward the hunters' guns. And then you heard it. The first sounds from the release points. Not the sharp crack of breaking wood you'd expected, but something gentler. The soft whisper of cage doors swinging open. The quiet rustle of movement in tall grass. Your accomplices had done their work well. Napoleon raised his rifle, sighting along the barrel toward the tree line where the driven game should appear. His marshals followed suit, their weapons trained on likely paths of approach. The entire hunting party stood ready, a picture of imperial martial competence. "Here they come," someone whispered. And they did come, but not as anyone expected. The first rabbit appeared at the edge of the clearing like a scout for an advancing army. It paused, nose twitching, ears alert, and then, rather than fleeing in terror as any sensible wild rabbit would do, it began to hop purposefully toward the line of hunters. "Odd," muttered Marshal Berthier, lowering his rifle slightly. "It's moving the wrong direction." You said nothing. You simply watched as more rabbits emerged from the grass. Dozens of them, then scores, all moving with the same unhurried determination toward the assembled company of France's finest military minds. "Timaisim," General Duroc began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words for what they seemed. Hungry. That's what they seemed. Hungry and accustomed to being fed by humans, and absolutely convinced that this gathering of people represented the finest dining opportunity of their young lives. Napoleon lowered his rifle as well, a frown creasing his features. This is not how rabbits behave." "No," you thought to yourself, sipping your wine and savouring the moment. "It certainly is not." The first rabbit reached Napoleon's boots and began to investigate them with the thorough attention of a wine merchant examining a vintage bottle. Within moments, others joined it, and the Emperor of the French found himself surrounded by a growing crowd of admirers whose interest in his person was entirely culinary. "Shoo," he said, with the tone of a man unused to having his commands ignored. "Away with you." The rabbits paid him no attention whatsoever. They had spotted movement, detected the possibility of food, and arranged their priorities accordingly. Imperial dignity ranked considerably lower than breakfast on their list of concerns. He watched it all with the detachment of a theatrical critic reviewing a particularly fine performance, the confusion spreading across aristocratic faces, the mounting bewilderment of men who'd conquered half of Europe but couldn't seem to discourage a handful of domestic rabbits, the dawning realization that something had gone terribly, wonderfully wrong. And this, you knew, was only the beginning. The situation evolved with the beautiful inevitability of a well-composed piece of music. You watched from your position among the lesser courtiers as the Emperor of the French discovered that conquest was considerably more complicated when one's opponent refused to acknowledge the rules of engagement. The rabbits didn't scatter, they surged. Not with the panic-driven flight of prey animals, but with the purposeful advance of creatures who had learned to associate the sight of humans with the promise of food. They moved like a fluffy tide toward the hunting party, their noses twitching with anticipation, their small eyes bright with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of the perpetually hungry. Napoleon tried dignity first. He stood straighter, puffed his chest, and fixed the approaching rabbits with the same steely gaze that had cowed the crowned heads of Europe. "Halt!" he commanded, in the voice that had launched 1,000 charges across a dozen battlefields. The rabbits were unimpressed. Rabbits, you reflected with quiet satisfaction, have no concept of imperial authority. They recognize only the fundamental truths of carrot and cabbage, lettuce and grain. Everything else is mere human nonsense. The first wave reached his boots, those magnificent new boots that had been crafted by Paris's finest cobbler, and began their investigation with the thoroughness of customs inspectors. Small teeth tested the leather. Tiny paws scrabbled for purchase on the polished surface. One particularly bold specimen began to gnaw experimentally on a brass buckle. "Get off!" Napoleon yelped, his composure cracking like ice in spring. He raised one foot to shake off his furry admirers, overbalanced, and had to grab Marshal Duroc's arm to avoid toppling entirely. "Get them off!" But removing one rabbit only provided space for 3 more to take its place. They pressed forward with the relentless determination of the truly devoted, climbing over one another in their eagerness to reach this fascinating new source of potential sustenance. Marshal Berthier, ever the loyal subordinate, attempted to come to his emperor's aid. He approached with his rifle raised like a club, clearly intending to beat the creatures away from his beloved leader. But as he drew near, the rabbits noticed him too, and a substantial portion of the furry army wheeled to investigate this new arrival. "Mon Dieu!" Berthier gasped, as rabbits began scaling his legs like mountaineers ascending a particularly attractive cliff face. They're climbing!" Indeed they were. Domestic rabbits, you had learned during your research, are considerably more athletic than their wild cousins might suggest. Generations of hutch life had not dulled their ancestral ability to scramble up rocky surfaces in search of food. And what, from a rabbit's perspective, was a human leg but a warm, mobile cliff that might have pockets full of vegetables? General Duroc tried a different approach. Drawing his sabre with a flourish that would have done credit to a cavalry charge, he swept it through the air above the rabbits' heads, clearly hoping to frighten them with displays of martial prowess. The rabbits ignored him entirely. They had more important concerns than flashing steel. They had detected the scent of leather and wool, the lingering aromas of breakfast and wine, the fascinating odours that clung to men who lived well and ate better. These were walking treasuries of potential food, and they intended to investigate thoroughly. You remained motionless, your wineglass steady in your hand, watching the tableau unfold with the appreciation of a connoisseur. This was why you had chosen domestic rabbits rather than their wild cousins. This was why you had ensured they were well fed before the hunt. Confident rabbits were bold rabbits, and bold rabbits were entertaining rabbits. Napoleon attempted another strategy. He tried to walk away from his furry admirers, but discovered that walking while wearing a carpet of interested rabbits was considerably more challenging than the military manuals had suggested. His first step was tentative, his second unsteady, his third resulted in a stumble that sent him lurching toward Marshal Murat. "Steady on!" Murat cried, catching his emperor before he could fall. But the marshal's heroic gesture only served to attract more rabbits, who had apparently decided that any gathering of humans was worth investigating. Soon both men were attempting to maintain their dignity, while small creatures explored their persons with the systematic thoroughness of tax collectors. "Shoot them!" Napoleon commanded, his voice rising to a pitch that would have been amusing under other circumstances. "Fire your weapons!" But firing into a crowd of rabbits swarming around one's own feet presented certain practical difficulties that had not been covered in artillery school. Marshal Lannes raised his rifle, sighted carefully, then lowered it again, with an expression of profound confusion. I cannot get a clear shot, Your Majesty," he reported. "They're too close to your person." One particularly enterprising rabbit had discovered Napoleon's coat pocket and was investigating its contents with great interest. Another had begun to gnaw thoughtfully on the gold braid that decorated his sleeve. A third was attempting to scale his back like a furry mountaineer, using the imperial sash as a climbing rope. "Then use your hands," Napoleon shrieked, batting at the creatures with increasing desperation. "Use your boots, use anything." And so the marshals of France, men who had stood firm against Austrian cavalry and Prussian artillery, who had crossed the Alps and conquered kingdoms, found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with an army of hungry rabbits. They swatted and grabbed, stomped and shooed, all while maintaining the facial expressions of men who were absolutely certain this could not possibly be happening to them. But for every rabbit they discouraged, two more appeared. The creatures seemed to materialize from the grass itself, an endless supply of soft, determined, utterly fearless adversaries who wanted nothing more than to investigate these interesting new food sources. He watched Napoleon's face cycle through a fascinating range of expressions. Confusion gave way to irritation, irritation to anger, anger to something approaching panic. His carefully waxed moustache had begun to droop. His perfect hair showed signs of disorder where rabbit paws had investigated it. His magnificent new hunting outfit bore the unmistakable signs of having been taste-tested by small, persistent teeth. The Emperor of the French was being defeated by lunch, and the lunch was winning decisively. A rabbit had worked its way up his chest and was now sitting on his shoulder like a furry epaulette, its whiskers twitching as it investigated his ear. Another had somehow got entangled in his sword belt and was hanging there like a living decoration, kicking gently as it tried to right itself. "This is not happening," Napoleon muttered, his voice taking on the hollow tone of a man whose worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome revision. "This cannot be happening. I am the Emperor of France. I do not lose to rabbits," you thought. You do not lose to rabbits. Except, apparently, you do. And the day was still young. What followed could only be described as a tactical withdrawal, though you suspected the military historians would struggle to find appropriate terminology for it. After all, there were no established protocols for retreating from an army of domestic rabbits, no matter how determined or numerous they might be. Napoleon made the decision to relocate with a sort of sudden, decisive action that had served him well on more conventional battlefields. "To the carriages," he commanded, his voice cracking slightly on the final word, as a particularly bold rabbit made a serious attempt to investigate the inside of his mouth. But retreat, as any military strategist knows, is often more dangerous than advance. It requires coordination, discipline, and above all, the ability to move in an orderly fashion while under pressure from pursuing forces. The rabbits, unfortunately, had not read the manual on proper battlefield etiquette. As Napoleon attempted his strategic withdrawal, he discovered that walking while covered in small, clinging creatures was an art form unto itself. His first step was confident enough, the stride of a man accustomed to having the ground remain stationary beneath his feet. His second step wavered as a rabbit tangled itself in his sword belt. His third step became a stumble as another creature decided to investigate the fascinating buckles on his boots. And his fourth step, his fourth step never came. You watched with the serene attention of a man observing a particularly fine piece of theatre as the Emperor of France performed an elaborate pirouette, his arms windmilling for balance, his face a masterpiece of concentrated alarm. For a moment he teetered on the edge of dignity, suspended between standing and falling like a dancer frozen at the climax of a performance. Then gravity, that most democratic of forces, asserted its authority. Napoleon went down in a tangle of limbs and rabbits, his magnificent new hunting coat spreading around him like the wings of some exotic bird. He landed with the sort of undignified thump that emperors are not supposed to make, his carefully arranged hair now suggesting he'd been struck by a small but very localized tornado. The rabbits, rather than being deterred by this development, seemed to interpret it as an invitation to closer examination. They swarmed over their fallen quarry with the enthusiasm of scholars who'd discovered a particularly fascinating manuscript, their small paws pattering across imperial fabric as they searched for anything edible. Marshal Berthier, ever faithful, rushed to assist his beloved emperor, but in his haste to help he failed to notice the rabbit that had positioned itself directly in his path like a small furry landmine. His boot caught the creature, which squeaked indignantly but remained unharmed, and sent the marshal stumbling forward in an elaborate dance that ended with him sprawled across Napoleon's legs. "Get off me, you fool!" Napoleon snarled from beneath his impromptu human blanket, his dignity now entirely in ruins. "I'm trying, Your Majesty," Berthier protested, attempting to rise while several rabbits investigated his pockets with professional thoroughness. "But they're everywhere." Indeed they were. What had begun as a manageable number of rabbits had somehow multiplied into what appeared to be every rabbit in France. They emerged from the grass like furry flowers blooming in fast motion, each new arrival drawn by the commotion and the tantalizing possibility of food. General Duroc attempted to create a protective perimeter around his fallen emperor, brandishing his sabre in wide arcs that would have impressed any human opponent. The rabbits paid him no attention whatsoever. They had more pressing concerns than theatrical sword work. "Form ranks!" Napoleon commanded from his undignified position on the ground. "Establish a firing line." But forming ranks while under assault by an army of domestic rabbits proved to be more challenging than anticipated. Every time one of the marshals attempted to take position, he found himself surrounded by creatures who seemed to view military formations as interesting new arrangements of potential food sources. Marshal Murat, resplendent in his elaborate uniform, tried to maintain some semblance of martial dignity while a rabbit investigated the god braid on his sleeve with the concentration of a jeweler examining precious stones. "This is impossible," he declared, attempting to brush away his small tormentor without damaging his carefully arranged decorations. "How does one fight an enemy that refuses to retreat?" "An excellent question," you reflected, sipping your wine with the calm appreciation of a man whose stratagems were proceeding exactly as planned. "How indeed does one defeat an opponent who lacks the good sense to be intimidated by imperial authority?" General Lannes decided to try a different approach. Drawing his pistol with the sort of dramatic flourish that looked impressive in paintings, he aimed carefully at a cluster of rabbits near Napoleon's boots. "No!" Napoleon shrieked, his voice climbing to heights that would have impressed the soprano at the Paris Opera. "Don't shoot near my feet, you madman!" Anis hesitated, his weapon wavering as he tried to find a target that wouldn't risk imperial toes. But while he deliberated, a rabbit had noticed his pistol and was investigating it with great interest, its small nose twitching as it tried to determine whether gunpowder might be edible. You watched the pistol discharge into the air as Lannes jumped back in surprise, the shot echoing across the meadow like a small thunderclap. The sound had no effect whatsoever on the rabbits, who had apparently decided that loud noises were simply another interesting feature of this remarkable feeding opportunity. Napoleon managed to achieve a sitting position, though he remained festooned with rabbits like a Christmas tree decorated with living ornaments. His face had progressed through several shades of red and was now approaching purple, a colour that clashed terribly with his hunting coat. "Where," he demanded, his voice tight with the sort of control that precedes either enlightenment or complete breakdown, "did all these rabbits come from?" An excellent question, and one to which you could have provided a most illuminating answer, but discretion had always been your greatest virtue, and you maintained your position among the courtiers with the innocent expression of a man who found this turn of events as surprising as anyone. Marshal Berthier, still tangled in Napoleon's legs and looking like a man who'd been struck by a small furry avalanche, attempted to provide an answer. I arranged for the usual number, Your Majesty. Perhaps they've multiplied." The Emperor's expression suggested he was considering whether multiplication was treason. It was at this moment that someone, you believed it was Colonel Savary, had the inspired idea of summoning the carriages. "The vehicles," he called, waving his hat in the air like a signal flag. "Bring the carriages immediately." And so began what military historians would undoubtedly record as the first imperial retreat from a battlefield commanded by rabbits. The drivers, to their credit, responded with admirable speed, wheeling their vehicles toward the embattled hunting party like cavalry charging to the rescue. But rescues, as you well knew, rarely proceeded as smoothly as their planners envisioned. The arrival of the carriages should have marked the end of Napoleon's ordeal. Should have, but didn't, because you had learned, through years of careful observation, that no plan, no matter how well conceived, ever survived contact with reality unchanged. And reality on this particular morning wore whiskers and had an insatiable appetite for adventure. The first carriage rolled toward the beleaguered hunting party like a ship approaching a distant shore, its wheels cutting neat tracks through the meadow grass. The driver, a stolid man named Claude, whose primary qualification was an ability to remain calm under pressure, had witnessed many unusual sights in his years of imperial service, but nothing, you suspected, had quite prepared him for the spectacle that now greeted him. Napoleon sat in the grass like some bizarre eastern potentate, his court of rabbits arranged around him in a semicircle that suggested either worship or a very patient queue for dinner. His hunting coat, once pristine, now bore the unmistakable signs of having been thoroughly investigated by small, curious teeth. His boots, those magnificent boots, had been tested for edibility by what appeared to be every rabbit in the province. "Your Majesty," the driver called, bringing his horses to a halt at what he judged to be a safe distance. Even the horses seemed uncertain about the situation, their ears twitching as they observed the unusual assembly before them. Napoleon attempted to rise with imperial dignity, but discovered that standing while wearing a decorative arrangement of rabbits required skills not taught at military academies. Each time he shifted position, his small admirers shifted with him, maintaining their formation with the precision of a veteran drill team. "Help me up, you fools!" he commanded his marshals, who rushed forward with the sort of desperate enthusiasm usually reserved for storming enemy fortifications. But assistance proved more complicated than anticipated. Marshal Berthier grasped Napoleon's right arm, while General Duroc took the left, and together they attempted to raise their emperor to his feet. The rabbits, however, had invested considerable effort in their current positions and were reluctant to give them up. Several had achieved comfortable perches on Napoleon's shoulders and were disinclined to relocate. The result was a sort of elaborate wrestling match between imperial dignity and furry determination. Napoleon rose slowly, like a ship being lifted by an incoming tide, his small passengers clinging to him with the tenacity of sailors in a storm. One particularly well-positioned rabbit maintained its seat on his head like a living hat, its ears alert and its expression suggesting deep satisfaction with current arrangements. "The door!" Napoleon gasped, staggering toward the carriage like a man walking through deep water. "Open the door!" But as the carriage door swung wide, the rabbits perceived new opportunities for exploration. The interior of an imperial vehicle, with its soft cushions and interesting corners, clearly represented an upgrade from the meadow grass. Several creatures abandoned their positions on Napoleon's person and leaped toward the carriage with the enthusiasm of passengers boarding a luxury ship. What followed was a scene that would have challenged the descriptive powers of the finest court painters. Napoleon, still festooned with rabbits, attempted to climb into a carriage that was rapidly filling with other rabbits who had arrived there independently. His marshals pushed from behind while creatures pulled from in front, creating a sort of furry tug-of-war with imperial dignity hanging in the balance. "Stop them!" Napoleon commanded, though it was unclear whom he was addressing or what exactly they were supposed to stop. "Don't let them in the carriage!" But stopping a determined rabbit, as you had learned through careful research, was considerably more difficult than stopping most other forms of wildlife. These creatures had been bred for centuries to be comfortable around humans, to view people as sources of food and shelter rather than threats to be avoided. They possessed the fearless confidence of the domesticated and the stubborn persistence of the perpetually hungry. Marshal Murat attempted to guard the carriage door, brandishing his sword in elaborate patterns that would have intimidated any sensible opponent. The rabbits simply flowed around him like water around a stone, their small bodies fitting through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow for creatures of their apparent size. He observed the developing chaos with the calm attention of a man watching a favorite play unfold exactly as rehearsed. Every detail proceeded according to plan, or rather, according to the beautiful absence of plan that characterized the most elegant catastrophes. General Lannes tried a different approach, attempting to create a clear path to the carriage by forming what military theorists would have called a corridor of fire. He and several other officers stood with weapons ready, prepared to discourage any rabbit that approached their emperor's evacuation route. But marksmanship, it turned out, was considerably more challenging when one's targets were small, fast-moving, and tangled around the person one was trying to protect. Every time someone aimed, a rabbit would shift position, or Napoleon would stumble, or another rabbit would appear from an unexpected direction. Can't get a clear shot, Lannis reported, his frustration evident in every syllable. Then don't shoot, you imbecile, Napoleon shrieked back, his voice muffled by the rabbit that had somehow positioned itself across his face like a furry mask. Just get me to the carriage. The evacuation proceeded in stages, each one more undignified than the last. Napoleon would make progress toward the vehicle, then pause to disentangle himself from particularly persistent rabbits. His marshals would rush to assist, only to become entangled themselves. The carriage driver maintained a carefully neutral expression, like a man who had decided that whatever he was witnessing was above his pay grade. Finally, through a combination of pushing, pulling, and what could only be described as controlled falling, Napoleon achieved the interior of the carriage. He collapsed onto the cushions with a gasp of relief that was immediately cut short as he realized he was not alone. Several rabbits had preceded him into the vehicle and were now investigating the upholstery with the methodical attention of interior decorators. "Drive," he commanded, his voice cracking with exhaustion and wounded pride. "Drive immediately." The carriage lurched into motion, but its passengers were not quite as intended. Along with the Emperor of France, it now carried what appeared to be a small but significant population of rabbits, all of whom seemed to be enjoying their unexpected journey. Through the window you could see Napoleon's face, a masterpiece of imperial mortification, as he tried to maintain some semblance of dignity while sharing his private conveyance with creatures who had no concept of protocol. The remaining members of the hunting party stood in the meadow, watching their emperor's retreat with expressions of profound bewilderment. Rabbits continued to emerge from the grass around them, like flowers blooming in the aftermath of a very strange storm. "And you? You finished your wine, straightened your coat, and prepared to make your own departure. Not in flight. That would have been beneath your dignity, but with the measured pace of a man whose morning's entertainment had concluded exactly as planned. As you walked toward your own carriage, you reflected on the morning's lessons. Power, you had demonstrated, was indeed a fragile thing, pride even more so. And sometimes the most devastating defeats came not from armies or artillery, but from the simple, unstoppable force of creatures who refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to be afraid. Behind you, rabbits continued to hop through the grass, their morning adventure concluded, their bellies full of imperial leather, and their small minds storing memories of the day they conquered France. History, you knew, would remember this morning. You would make certain of that. The story aged like the finest wine in your cellars, improving with time, growing more complex with each retelling. You never told it yourself, of course. That would have been crude, obvious, beneath your considerable talents. Instead, you let it tell itself, whispered it into the right ears at the right moments. "Such a shame about the hunt," you might murmur to Talleyrand over cards. "I understand His Majesty encountered some unexpected opposition." "Opposition?" he would ask, already knowing the answer. "Rabbits," you would reply, letting the word hang in the air like incense. "Domestic rabbits, apparently quite hungry ones." The story spread through Paris with beautiful efficiency. In officers' quarters it became a tale of strategy defeated by creatures with walnut-sized brains. Among nobility, a lesson about pride humbled. In coffee houses, a metaphor for the absurdity of absolute power. Napoleon never spoke of it, but you would catch him sometimes, touching his boots as if checking for small teeth marks, glancing suspiciously at any furry creature that crossed his path. The imperial diet had mysteriously eliminated rabbit, a change attributed to evolving tastes rather than trauma. You continued your work with quiet satisfaction. The beauty lay not just in the immediate effects, though watching the emperor defeated by his lunch remained endlessly entertaining, but in the lasting lesson. Power was more fragile than its possessors believed. The man who commanded armies had been undone by creatures most people considered suitable only for stew. The rabbits accomplished what Austrian cavalry could not. They made Napoleon Bonaparte seem human, and human, as you well knew, was far more vulnerable than divine. The months that followed brought other challenges, other campaigns. Napoleon's empire expanded, but something fundamental had changed that morning. The spell of invincibility had been broken by the most ridiculous means imaginable, and once broken could never be completely repaired. The rabbits themselves returned to ordinary lives, unaware of their historical significance. Some recaptured, some escaped to the wild, all carrying the legacy of creatures brave enough to challenge absolute power and win. On quiet evenings you would pour wine and remember that morning. Napoleon's face as he realized his authority meant nothing to creatures who recognized only hunger and opportunity. His voice climbing to operatic heights as he commanded rabbits with no interest in imperial authority. And you would smile. Not your political smile, but genuine satisfaction. You had changed history using nothing but domestic rabbits and perfect timing. In the end, power was indeed fragile. But sometimes the most devastating victories came from understanding simple truths. Pride goeth before a fall, especially when orchestrated by someone patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to open exactly the right cages. You had needed no armies, no artillery, no complicated schemes, only an understanding of human nature, knowledge of rabbit behavior, and exquisite timing. The rabbits had won, as you always knew they would, and through them, so had you. Because sometimes the meek really do inherit the earth. They just need a little help with the timing, and perhaps a few well-placed vegetables to motivate their conquest. Sweet dreams.